Hi, I'm Scott Harris, co-founder and executive producer of Between the Lines Radio Newsmagazine, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our program's 30th anniversary celebration, where we'll be addressing the crisis in U.S. journalism and the future of independent media and democracy.
Hi, I'm Elaine Osowski. Tonight we're very excited to bring you a panel discussion on the crisis in U.S. journalism, featuring former Ohio State Senator and activist Nina Turner, investigative reporter Greg Palast, labor and racial justice activist Bill Fletcher Jr., and youth climate activist Adrian Huq, moderated by Victor Picard, professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication.
It's really hard to believe 30 years have gone by since our first program in 1991 that was focused on combating the propaganda surrounding the first Persian Gulf War, launched by then President H.W. Bush. Over the past 3 decades, our nationally syndicated program, broadcast on more than 70 stations each week, has provided in-depth, timely, progressive analysis on a wide range of political, economic, and social issues. In presenting interviews connected with current events, politics, and societal debates, Between the Lines has served as a networking resource for communities fighting for social justice here in the U.S. and around the world. As we begin our program tonight, I want to give special thanks to Between the Lines' generous donors from across the country who supported our show financially all these years. Many of them are watching tonight's celebration. And of course, we recognize the essential contribution of our show's producers and members of the board of our nonprofit organization, Squeaky Wheel Productions, which distributes our program each week. One of the things that makes Between the Lines unique among radio programs like ours is that all the people who produce the show each week are volunteers. We take pride in the fact that this radio program has been powered and driven by dozens of unpaid citizen journalists who over the past 3 decades have dedicated their time and talents to the show because they have a deep passion for bringing our audience progressive perspectives and information that's often ignored or marginalized elsewhere in corporate media. Our Between the Lines producers and volunteers are Richard Hill, Anna Manzo, co-founder of the show Denise Manzari, Bob Nixon, Marco Roldan, Leslie Rudden, Melinda Tuhus, Catherine Urbane, Jeff Yates, Susan Bramhall, Mary Hunt, Ruth Ann Baumgartner, Susan Fazekas, and Elaine Osowski, who's here to guide us through the rest of the show.
Thanks, Scott. Before we get to our panel discussion, we wanted to take this time to tell you a little bit about our program and hear from some of our many friends and supporters. Right now, we'll take a look at a short video about Between the Lines history, the issues we cover, and why we do what we do.
Hi, my name is Scott Harris, executive producer of Between the Lines Radio Newsmagazine, heard each week on more than 60 radio stations here in the U.S. and abroad. Since 1991, our radio show has provided our listeners timely, in-depth progressive analysis.
We began producing the show during the first Persian Gulf War, when President George W. Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, sent the U.S. military to battle Saddam Hussein's forces over that nation's occupation of Kuwait.
Now, as then, America's corporate media continues to be a thinly veiled propaganda machine serving the interests of the rich and powerful, reliably parroting the talking points of our government's justification for imperial wars for access to oil and other resources, as well as projecting America's geopolitical dominance.
The consolidation of media ownership in the U.S. from 50 major companies in 1983 to only 6 today creates a dangerous climate where the homogeneity of information means a nation of uninformed citizens, who in turn, more often than not, elect leaders based on deliberately distorted views received from media outlets whose bias almost always favors powerful corporate interests.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Between the Lines' ongoing mission has always been to provide alternative points of view and analysis about global conflicts, economic warfare being waged against the nation's working and middle-class families to benefit Wall Street,
groups working to counter the wholesale destruction of the planet's environment, and to inform our listeners about the dangerous erosion of civil rights, civil liberties, and free and fair democratic elections.
In our weekly program, Between the Lines provides critical points of view, not only to reveal the unseemly motives and dire consequences of the Trump agenda, but also to profile the creative and effective work of grassroots activist groups offering a progressive alternative to timid opposition from the Democratic Party.
But more importantly, to offer a vision for the future beyond the compromised and conventional neoliberal solutions approved by wealthy donors to both the Democratic and Republican parties, who consistently prop up the failing status quo.
In the spirit of the direct action tactics of Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the worker-led Fight for 15 movement, and anti-pipeline climate activists, Between the Lines presents insight and analysis of an America more resilient and engaged in creating a more just and sustainable world than that portrayed in mainstream media.
Because independent media is key to providing information untainted by powerful interest groups, because honest, reliable news and analysis is the lifeblood of a vibrant and inclusive participatory democracy, we're asking you to join our supporters, who include Ralph Nader, The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill, The Nation magazine's John Nichols, investigative reporter Greg Palast, and many others.
Your contribution will help Between the Lines reach a wider audience by building our media platform to effectively connect with people searching for timely, in-depth, progressive analysis, especially in cities and towns where alternative media sources are difficult to find.
As George Orwell said, speaking the truth in times of universal deceit is a revolutionary act. Each week, Between the Lines strives to bring you the voices of dissent that will help get us closer to the truth that we all seek.
One of our longtime friends and supporters is singer-songwriter David Rovics, whose music gives voice to the many struggles for peace and social justice across the globe. We're very glad to open our program tonight with this song from David titled, If His Name Were Jamal Khashoggi.
Well, this is David Rovics, and it is a great honor to be participating in this celebration of the 30th anniversary of the existence of the wonderful weekly program at WPKN, Between the Lines. And we need shows like Between the Lines more now than perhaps ever. In this age of social media and corporate media and very little real media. I'll do a little song that is about the double standard, and hopefully it makes sense. I won't try to explain it first. If he were wanted by a nation not run by the rule of law, if senators and generals had so often made the call that he should be hit with a missile if they had said this on TV, what would you expect from a legal authority? Ask to extradite him back to this country if his name were Jamal Khashoggi. If he were wanted by a nation which had sent its spies to arrange a situation where he accidentally dies, if they had secretly listened in on all his conversations, if they had explicitly made plans for his assassination, would you write it off as just a strange conspiracy? If his name were Jamal Khashoggi. Were wanted by a nation they so frequently condemn in human rights tribunals held at the UN for torturing their prisoners for the ways they are confined. If the state had a different name, would justice be so blind? Would your courts just hand him over, take him from his family? If his name were Jamal Khashoggi. If he were wanted by a nation which committed the war crimes exposed by this reporter, so many times. Would you just take the word of the head of state who said he would be so happy to see a bullet in his head? If their main witness was coerced, would you send him to that country? If his name were Jamal Khashoggi. They were wanted by a nation that did all these things and more. If it were Iran or Russia, would you be keeping score? Would you trust their prosecutors, all the nice things that they say about their justice system before they take him away? What if his name were Julian? Would you send him across the sea? If his name were Jamal Khashoggi.
Thanks, David, for contributing your song, If His Name Were Jamal Khashoggi, to tonight's anniversary celebration. A song that contrasts the cases of two journalists exposing the double standards and hypocrisy when it comes to freedom of the press in our country.
Right now, we'll be hearing from some of Between the Lines' friends and supporters, from the worlds of media, journalism, academia, and activism, offering congratulations to BTL on our 30th anniversary and briefly discussing their views on the importance of independent media in this very dangerous moment for American democracy.
Hello, I'm John Nichols from The Nation magazine. A quarter century ago, when Robert W. McChesney and I started writing books about media and democracy, we looked around the United States for examples of people and institutions that got it right. Sadly, we didn't find that many, but one of them we discovered was in Connecticut at WPKN, where Scott Harris had begun a news magazine show called Between the Lines. Between the Lines, even then, was an example of what we thought journalism ought to be about, of what we thought radio commentary ought to focus on. It was always an outlier. The tragedy is there aren't that many shows like Between the Lines, and there aren't that many people like Scott Harris. And so we focused on him, and we've continued to do so throughout the years that have passed. The sad thing is that even as time has gone on, there haven't been that many programs that have rivaled what Scott has done with Between the Lines. I wish there were. I wish he had a lot of competition all over this country. But the fact of the matter is that Scott Harris and Between the Lines stand out. What's been done at WPKN is unique, not just for Connecticut, but for the whole country and really on an international stage. The good news is that we live in a digital age where communications in one place can reach out to the whole rest of the country and the rest of the world. And so a lot of people around the US and even in other countries know the work that Scott has done. But that isn't enough. What we have to do is spread the word even more. So I'm delighted to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Between the Lines. And I'm delighted, of course, to celebrate Scott's good work. But what I want to tell you is that we have to do more to amplify it. We have to make sure that this remarkable program, with its focus on economic and social and racial justice and peace and on saving the planet, becomes a staple for radio listeners and digital tuners in Connecticut, across the country, and around the world. Scott is a remarkable treasure. This program is a tremendous institution, and I'm delighted to celebrate its 30th anniversary.
Hello, I'm Ursula Rudenberg, affiliate network manager for Pacifica Radio Network, and I'm so pleased to be part of this 30-year celebration for Between the Lines. In thinking over this dangerous moment for American democracy, I decided to ask my father for insight. Like many of us baby boomers, I've been perpetually concerned and alarmed by American politics, but I have no real experience with this level of crisis. However, my father, who is a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who grew up in Nazi Germany, has had plenty of experience with dangerous politics. My father became a refugee in Switzerland as a teenager during World War II, and it was there that he first discovered democracy. And the encounter with democracy is something that was a distinct memory for him. So I asked him, what does it mean to experience democracy for the first time? What's the difference between what you experienced in an autocratic or fascist country, and what you experienced in a democracy. And he said, oh, that's easy. I experienced that for the first time, people could talk to each other. In Nazi Germany, there was no information and people could not talk to each other. People had their own thoughts, of course, but public discourse was completely impossible. So there you have it. That's us, right? We are the independent media. We are the discourse. That's what we do. We are the essence of democracy. And so let's keep talking. And congratulations, Between the Line, for 30 years of doing exactly that. I really deeply admire the work that you've done. And I'm so grateful for the team effort under the guidance of Scott Harris, of all the talent and time given so selflessly. It's been a truly patriotic work. And we really, really admire what you do. At Pacifica, we're so grateful to be able to distribute your work. We're proud to, and we are proud that you've been a pillar for many, many years of our content management and distribution. Oh, and by the way, in case you were wondering, yes, my father is worried about what's happening in America today.
You know, Scott Harris and Between the Lines are a gift to people eager for solid information, a gift to people just searching around for something kind of interesting, a gift most of all to our movements who so desperately need information that we can rely on these days. Information on all the various crises that we're facing right now. Inequality is skyrocketing. COVID is still rampant. Racism is exploding. Xenophobia and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are all rising. And the wars, so many wars. The so-called smaller wars that are supposed to be winding down, but somehow they keep on keeping on. And the big wars that are looming even today as we speak. The harder stuff, Israeli apartheid and Palestinian rights, figuring out the Iran nuclear deal. Scott talks about all of that. I remember some years ago talking with Scott about one of the wars. I think it might have been Syria, maybe it was Afghanistan. I was visiting my sister out in California, and she was listening while I was on the phone, on the air. And afterwards she said, you know, you sounded like you were just having a conversation with someone. And I told her, that's what Scott Harris makes possible. That's just what I was doing, having a conversation. The kind of conversations we so desperately need. And that's the reason that alternative media sources are all so important, that they matter so much. The reason that Scott Harris and Between the Lines remain so very important. Thanks for all of it.
Over the years, I have occasionally worked with Between the Lines. It was always an important event, a chance to get conversation on the air that is desperately needed by a society that does not allow this kind of conversation in much of the mainstream. It was an honor for me. It was a chance to have the conversations publicly that the society needs. In my opinion, the year 2022 is a culmination of a series of events in the economy of this country that are bringing us to a word I do not often use, but I will use now, a crisis ecological, a crisis in our relations with the rest of the world, a crisis in the struggle between inflation and recession that this country has never mastered. So it could not come at a more important time to celebrate Between the Lines, because it dares to face these kinds of realities and to put them on the table to be discussed, to be debated, and to be explored. There is no greater service that media can perform at this critical time in US history, and I salute Between the Lines for always having had the courage to do exactly that.
Hi, I'm Steve DiCostanzo. I'm the general manager of Community Radio WPKN in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm honored and I'm thrilled to have been asked by Scott Harris to be a part of Between the Lines Radio Newsmagazine's 30th year on the air celebration. Congratulations are definitely in order. Between the Lines was born at WPKN, and we're very proud that our station had a role in bringing this program to the dozens of radio stations across the US. Between the Lines, staffed by an all-volunteer production group for the past 30 years, is really a kindred spirit to WPKN. It has demonstrated a strong commitment to its listeners and its resiliency in the face of many obstacles, funding and otherwise, to keep this award-winning program going for 3 decades. Independent radio stations like WPKN and programs like Between the Lines are critical in bringing the voices of marginalized progressive views and music and culture to a broader audience. For me, shows like Between the Lines remind me how important their voice really is against a backdrop of mainstreaming news and a weakening of investigative journalism. I can tell you all that Between the Lines remains one of our most favored talk-based shows. Please support great programming like Between the Lines, and please support independent media like your very own community radio stations. Listener support is more important than ever. It's still the lifeblood of independent media, and it's still the lifeblood of maintaining a healthy democracy as well. Congratulations to Between the Lines and many, many more.
Hi, I'm Matt Murphy, the General Manager of WERU Community Radio, speaking to you from the coast of Maine. Thank you and congratulations to Between the Lines for 30 years on the airwaves. Between the Lines is our weekly punctuation mark and exclamation point for news and public affairs programming, heard every Friday afternoon at 5:30. We're proud to have this supremely informative and powerful program in our schedule. We carry Between the Lines because of the excellent journalism and interviews, but also because it's a source of inspiration for our listeners and community. It's not just about reporting the news, but also about making connections and becoming active in the fight for social justice. It's a perfect fit for independent community radio stations like ours that seek to inform and empower. Independent media, like Between the Lines, is so critical because it's not about making money, but rather about making a difference. Independent media shows us that despite the odds, all is not lost, and that we can connect with others to have a positive impact. Once again, thank you and congratulations to everyone at Between the Lines for 30 years of excellence.
30 years of Between the Lines is really a triumph for progressive organizing in media. What Scott Harris has done with probably hundreds and hundreds of guests over those 3 decades is to say, not only conceptually, but in practice, that we can become media that don't depend on corporate power, don't contend with top-down power without fighting back. And that's why I'm so glad to join with so many others in congratulating Scott Harris and Between the Lines. We're in a media context, in a political context of corporate power and militarism, where as much or more than ever, we need Between the Lines, and let's support it. Let's support what Scott Harris is doing for all of our benefit. This 30th anniversary of Between the Lines comes at a time of tremendous right-wing power and tremendous militarism. And the challenge that we continue to face is one that Scott Harris and Between the Lines have continued to help us to pursue. And that is simultaneously to fight against the most terrible forces in our society, the racists, the xenophobes, the misogynists, the repressive forces of power from the top down, and also our necessity to organize for genuine progressive change. And without progressive media outlets, that task will be impossible. So we're making it possible with organizing and media projects like Between the Lines. And that's as good a reason as any, a great reason to congratulate Between the Lines, congratulate Scott Harris, and move forward as we know we must.
Hi, my name is Medea Benjamin with the Peace Group Code Pink, and I'm here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Between the Lines and say how wonderful it is and how important it is that we have this kind of radio that gives us the real news, especially at a time like now, when the US is careening towards a military conflict with Russia. And what happens when you put on the corporate news? You're going to hear a lot of sensationalizing. You're going to hear a lot of demonizing of Putin. You're going to hear a lot of black and white, US good, NATO good, Russia bad. And you're not going to hear the context of all of this conflict to be able to really understand the problem and, more importantly, understand the solutions, which are negotiated solutions. And so when you turn on Between the Lines, you're going to hear that kind of complexity. You're going to hear about the expansionism of NATO, despite the promise to the Russians that we weren't going to go 1 inch closer towards their border. You're going to hear about the US involvement in the 2014 coup that overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. And you're going to hear about things like the Minsk agreement, the framework that we now have to revive that was hammered out in 2015, but can be the framework now for a peaceful solution to the conflict. And so I just want to say congratulations to Between the Lines. Thank you so much for the work that you have done for 30 years to educate the public and to motivate the public to find solutions to the problems that plague us as a country and as a world. Congratulations.
Many thanks to John, Ursula, Phyllis, Richard, Steve, Matt, Norman, and Medea, and all of our friends, listeners, and supporters who've made our program possible for these 30 years. Before we present this evening's panel discussion, I want to take a few minutes to discuss the crisis in U.S. journalism that our panelists will be addressing shortly. After 3 decades of producing our weekly program, we believe more strongly than ever that independent news organizations like ours are vital in this era of rising domestic terrorism, right-wing disinformation being weaponized in politics, public health, and public education, and of course the well-funded current effort to overthrow our democracy. Sadly, journalism in the U.S. is now an endangered species. Since 2004, about 1,800 newspapers have closed in the U.S., and tens of thousands of reporters have been laid off. Many of these publications and broadcast news outlets were the only source of local news in their communities, creating news deserts. Over many decades, corporate media has failed to adequately inform the American people about who holds the real power in our nation's politics and economy, and why the U.S. has for most of our history been involved in countless bloody wars abroad or covert action to subvert or overthrow governments Washington doesn't approve of. It's also a major reason why the U.S. has one of the highest rates of economic inequality in the world, and is the only industrialized nation that lacks universal health care. Important news stories about these power relationships are by and large ignored or trivialized in favor of horse race coverage about which team is ahead and which team is behind. Corporate news outlets have blatant conflicts of interest, when literally billions of dollars in their revenue stream are generated by advertising from the American Petroleum Institute, health insurance companies, and defense and aerospace manufacturers of weapons of war. Why would we expect that their coverage of climate change, America's healthcare crisis, and U.S. wars abroad wouldn't be tainted by this dirty money? Think of all the corporate news propaganda we've been subjected to for decades. We were told that taxing the rich will ruin the economy, but tax cuts for the wealthy didn't trickle down. We were told that better wages for workers drives inflation, but smashing labor unions didn't get us better pay. We were told that privatizing schools was more efficient and would save taxpayer dollars, but defunding our public schools hasn't improved the quality of our children's education. Corporations lie to us, and corporate media is the conduit for those lies. All too often, corporate reporters think it's their job to act as stenographers to the politicians and corporate overlords in power, simply providing their audience with a dutiful recitation of the Democratic and Republican or corporate and anti-corporate positions on any given issue, as if there were only two sides. But journalism professor Jonathan Foster offered some common sense guidance for those who wanted to practice journalism when he advised, if someone says it's raining outside and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the fucking window and find out which is true. Familiar tools used by corporate media to distort and distract include false equivalence and both sidesism. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and creator of the landmark 1619 Project, provided a perfect example of this when she recently demanded that journalists stop calling the U.S. Senate's failure to pass the voting rights bill a major setback for Democrats. It's a major setback for democracy, she said. The right to vote is not a partisan issue. Stop framing it as such and legitimizing anti-voter efforts. Corporate media continues to cover the Republican Party, its politicians and operatives, as a mainstream political organization, when in fact the GOP has officially endorsed a fascist agenda and embraced political violence as a means to gain and hold on to power. Republicans today are openly and methodically working to dismantle democracy, but corporate media won't tell you that truth, very directly jeopardizing our nation's future. I recently received feedback about our Between the Lines program that spoke to the value and power of independent media. A woman from Illinois recently emailed us to ask for a copy of an interview we'd conducted with her son in 2004, an Iraq War veteran who shared with our listeners the waste and corruption of corporate contractors like Halliburton that he witnessed firsthand profiteering off that misbegotten war. Sadly, this young man who suffered from PTSD took his own life last November, and his mom wanted the interview to hear his voice again. Another woman from Missouri recently told me that after listening to one of our interviews describing the abuse and discrimination suffered by Palestinians, she was inspired to become active on the issue herself and eventually started producing a radio show covering underreported news about the Palestinian conflict. A thriving and independent free press is essential to democracy. Without it, the vacuum is filled by purveyors of disinformation, often financed by the very same corporations and institutions that profit from citizens' ignorance of what's going on in their communities, their states, the nation, and the world. While right-wing media outlets prosper and multiply, benefiting from large grants from extremist foundations, progressive media is constantly in a life-and-death struggle just to survive. In my view, it's well past time to build a framework for progressive media outlets nationally to collaborate and support one another in order to cross-promote our content and to generate the resources needed to more effectively reach the American people with points of view that they may otherwise never read, see, or hear. Right now, I'm very honored to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel discussion, Victor Pickard, who's graciously offered to lead this important conversation today on the crisis in U.S. journalism and the future of independent media and democracy. Victor Pickard is the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication, where he directs the Media, Inequality, and Change Center. Victor has published 6 books, including America's Battle for Media Democracy and Democracy Without Journalism, Confronting the Misinformation Society. We'll now turn the program over to you, Victor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you for organizing this panel. It's such a privilege and honor to moderate this panel with such excellent guests and talking about such important issues, as well as commemorating the 30th anniversary of Between the Lines. I've been fortunate to be a guest on your show, Scott, a number of times, and I've always been able to talk about issues on your show that I'm unable to talk about on any other news program, especially mainstream media outlets. And I think that just underscores why it's so important that we figure out how to support and expand independent media like Between the Lines. So for this, I'm very grateful, and I'd like to now I'd like to now introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to introduce each panelist, and then everyone will give opening statements. After that, I will ask a few questions of each panelist, and then the panel as a whole. That will be followed by some concluding statements from each panelist, and then, depending on how much time we have left, we'll end with a few final questions from listeners that have been forwarded to me. So first up, we have Nina Turner. Nina, of course, does not need an introduction, but I'll give one anyway. Turner made history in 2005 as the first woman to represent Ward 1 on the Cleveland City Council, and again in 2008 as the first African-American woman to serve as a state senator in Ohio's 25th district, where she defended against attacks on women's health care, freedom, and partnered with working families and organized labor to protect collective bargaining rights, as well as work towards criminal justice reform. Nina Turner became a national surrogate for Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign and national co-chair for Bernie 2020. More recently, she ran a grassroots campaign in Ohio's 11th congressional district that focused on advancing policies for working families in Northeast Ohio. Next, we have Adrian Huq, who's a youth climate activist and organizer from Derby, Connecticut. Adrian is a sophomore at Tufts University, majoring in applied environmental studies and minoring in film and media studies. They serve as the co-founder of New Haven Climate Movement's Youth Action Team, and since 2018, they've also been working with the Climate Health Education Project to facilitate high school student internships, which advances youth-led climate education in the New Haven area schools. Adrian is also a freelancer for the New Haven Arts paper and works on communications at the Tufts Office of Sustainability and the Urban Resources Initiative. They also served as a radio show host for Teen Talk on 94.3 WYBC. And I'm sure I'm going to leave out a few details in all of our introductions, but I expect panelists will have ample time to fill in some of the gaps. Next up, we have Greg Palast. Excuse me while I'm looking for, I'm sorry, I apologize. Next up, we will hear from Bill Fletcher Jr., a longtime labor activist who has worked for several unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. He's a former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and the author of several books, including They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Fletcher is also a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator. And last not least, we will hear from investigative journalist Greg Palast, who's been reporting on vote suppression for 22 years for The Guardian, BBC Television, Rolling Stone, Democracy Now!, and Between the Lines. He's the author of several New York Times bestsellers, including The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, which is now a feature documentary. And for the past several years, he's been concentrating on vote suppression trickery in Georgia, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about momentarily. So first up, as we hear from each panelist, we have Nina Turner. Nina, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be here with all of you, the esteemed panelists. Scott, thank you again for pulling us all together. Independent media is so vitally important, especially in this moment where we're battling both neo-fascism and neoliberalism. And the major thing, in my opinion, that is lacking from mainstream media is a class consciousness. Rarely are the stories told from a class, a working class, a poor people's lens. The dominant lens is always that of the ultra wealthy and the ultra powerful. And by mainstream media clearly using that lens 99% of the time, it definitely limits opportunities to have robust dialogue and reflection and information about whole swaths of the American population who are among the poor, the working poor, and the barely middle class. This media is also tangled up with the same corporate interests that have bought off the Congress and also other levels of government, but particularly on the federal level. And so it taints the view. It really taints reality. And there are so many Americans, they have a steady diet of mainstream media. They rarely view any other forms of media. And so this is why one of the very important reasons why independent media must continue to grow, because other voices, other vantage points must be heard, and to give the American people, and dare I say the world, other lenses by which to view situations in this country and throughout the world.
Thank you so much, Nina. Next, we will hear from Adrian Huq.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me today. I wanted to speak on the pitfalls of corporate media in covering the climate crisis. So while the media industry has done a lot of good in amplifying climate-related news, it has failed to give climate change enough attention, hold politicians accountable, push more nuanced conversations, and more. So the media provides a unique opportunity for the public to be informed about issues such as climate change. Mass media is a critical agent in the way that climate issues are framed in the public opinion, and it's also an important player in climate change communication, since the general population does not often read scientific reports or specialized websites and blogs, or, for example, the reports of the IPCC. Although in theory, the facts of climate change should be reported in a straightforward way by media outlets, considerable differences exist between organizations about the reality and the seriousness of climate change, often due to the political perspective of each media organization. These positions influence their audience's perceptions of climate change, and media-generated controversy often contributes to why some people remain skeptical. Another pitfall at times is that journalists are taught to present both sides of the story. However, when it comes to climate change, this can lead their audience into thinking that both sides of the story are equal. If skeptics and deniers are given the same airtime and print space as climate scientists, for example, it creates the illusion that there is a valid and ongoing debate happening about the reality of climate change. In 2020, there was a drastic decrease in climate coverage despite numerous extreme weather events, important reports and news about climate change's effects, environmental protection rollbacks, and a presidential election in which climate change was a hot topic. The volume of corporate broadcast TV news coverage of climate change was only 112 minutes, which was a 53% decrease from 2019. And overall, climate coverage in 2020 made up only 0.4% of overall coverage on corporate news shows. A third of all climate segments also only aired in September, where there were wildfires in the Western US. So when we're considering the sheer amount of climate stories in 2020, this is a sad underperformance in covering the largest threat that we face as a planet. Representation also remains an issue in climate journalism. White males and current politicians dominated climate segments in 2020. Meanwhile, people of color made up only 8% of guests who were interviewed or featured in the corporate broadcast network's climate coverage, and women made up 20% of guests. Only 9% of guests were scientists, and Greta Thunberg was the only climate activist to be featured in a climate segment. Additionally, only 29% of segments mentioned potential solutions or actions related to addressing climate change. Former New York Times climate reporter Kendra Pierre-Louis said, quote, "For the past 10 to 15 years, there has been a form of climate journalism that focuses on the problem to such a degree that it can be disempowering. People can feel like the scale of the problem is so large and that there aren't any solutions," end quote. So now we get to, how can the media improve on its climate-related journalism? I believe that the media should help communicate climate-related science and the impacts of climate change in an accessible way, give a diverse array of scientists, activists, and policymakers a platform to speak, cover the climate crisis both in a localized and global way, and humanize the climate crisis. They should check their facts and press public officials to respond on what they're doing to combat the climate crisis. They should dedicate more time to talking about climate change and discussing solutions. News media covering extreme weather reports should prioritize stories of those on the front lines of the climate crisis. When reporting about storms, there should be a connection made to climate change rather than framing them as an isolated phenomena. Lastly, reporting should not be concentrated on just times of extreme weather and humanitarian crisis, but throughout the year. And so in conclusion, I believe that independent media plays a crucial role in reaching these goals. Independent journalism is especially important with this topic of climate change, as it provides a truth-seeking alternative to misinformation and disinformation, can expose the weaponization of information and investigate its roots, amplify marginalized and frontline voices, provide public access to information on climate change, and potentially provide more localized information on climate impacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Next up, we have Bill Fletcher.
Thank you, Victor, and I appreciate being invited to participate in this discussion. Briefly, I think that in mainstream media, but also unfortunately in much of independent media, there is an oscillation between fatalism and denial. And we see that with regard to both the environmental catastrophe as well as the political situation. It's strange because sometimes it comes from the same outlets, where, for instance, with regard to politics, because Adriana laid out the issue of the climate, and you find this situation after the November 2020 elections, where almost immediately the mainstream liberal media was predicting the outcome of the 2022 midterm elections and assuming that it would be a disaster for Democrats. And it was 2 years in advance, and they started to lay the foundation for a certain kind of fatalism. The fatalism can become a trap. That becomes very, very difficult to get out of. And we see this in multiple outlets. We certainly see this when it comes to the environment, where you have a combination of there is nothing that we really can do versus the situation is really not that bad. And so I think that there's a task, not just with regard to the mainstream media, but in independent journalism, to oppose both elements of this, the oscillation towards fatalism or towards denial, and to start thinking very concretely about what must be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Greg, you're up.
What I want to call attention to is the stories you never get. I'm an investigative reporter. I'm born here in Los Angeles, and I basically had to go into exile to become an investigative reporter. I was an investigator, and I found my stories weren't covered in the US press. So I decided to write them myself and found that they still couldn't be covered. I had to move, and I ended up as an investigative reporter for BBC Television, Newsnight, and for the Guardian newspapers. And just before this program, and by the way, I really want to thank Scott Harris and Between the Lines, because I'm about to tell you about 10 stories that were spiked. It took me just a few minutes to make a list of 10 major stories spiked, which you never heard, except on Between the Lines and a few independent programs. We begin, I'll just go dance through some and you can ask me questions about them as we get the discussion later. It actually began in 1989 when I was chief investigator on the Exxon Valdez crack-up. And Exxon and the US press simply swallowed the line that it was a drunken skipper who hit a reef. You know, that someone at the wheel just smashed into a reef. Well, the skipper wasn't even at the helm. The truth was Exxon had turned off the radar on the Exxon Valdez. Furthermore, British Petroleum had lied about the fact that they had the equipment right at the spot where the ship hit. There was supposed to be spill prevention cleanup equipment. It wasn't there. They lied. They literally lied. None of those stories came out. Why is that important? Because drunken skipper hits reef is a nice corporate story about human frailty. And gee, we're so sorry that we let a drunk at the wheel. He wasn't even at the wheel. So the story of corporate penny pinching, which led to disaster, never came out. There was a little mention of my work by Alana Sullivan of the Wall Street Journal. That was it. Then we get to 2000. I'm working for The Guardian and BBC Television on the front page of The Guardian and at the top of the nightly news primetime BBC. I announced right after the 2000 election the reason why George Bush won Florida by just 537 votes is that Katherine Harris and his brother Jeb Bush, George's brother Jeb, governor of Florida, had removed 58,000 Black people from the voter rolls. I actually had their names and addresses And that was the front page. It was all over the world on the front pages, top of the nightly news, except in America, where it bounced off the electronic Berlin Wall. The New York Times reported the story in 2004, 4 years later, saying, we don't want a repeat of the infamous Florida felon purge. Well, what do you mean infamous? You never ran the story in the first place. There was a mention, I should say, in Bob Herbert's column. Not incidentally, Bob Herbert was then their token black columnist, and he put in the story of the mass purge of voters. So it wasn't covered. Then we get to in that same article in 2000 in The Guardian, and then in my book, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, but in The Guardian, I ran a story how George Bush Sr. was a top official of a gold mining company from Canada, Barrick Gold Mining. And that company buried alive, its predecessor company buried alive 50 miners in Tanzania to steal their gold fields. I ran that story. And I was sued by Barrick. New York Times, they backed off when there was an international response. It was taken off of, it was retracted by Canadian outlets because they were afraid of the lawsuits. It was pulled out of the Canadian and British editions of my book. The great journalist John Pilger wanted me to put it in the Oxford Book of the World's Greatest Journalism, where he gave me 3 of my articles. Nice guy. But it was impossible to print because of threats of legal action. And then the New York Times, which does not face legal action, did a story on Barrick Gold Mining, never mentioning that it was George Bush's gold mining company. And when I brought this up at the Columbia School of Journalism, a New York Times editor got up and said, "How dare you accuse the New York Times of cowardice?" And sitting next to me was a guy named Seymour Hersh, who said, "Oh, that's the editor that got me fired from the Times." Just this past year on Democracy Now!, I ran a report about vote suppression in Georgia. It was repeated by Consortium News, and it was removed by YouTube. Because at the beginning of it, I had Trump people saying the election was stolen. And then I proved why in Georgia, and I proved why it wasn't. But it was taken down by YouTube. And thank you very much, Progressive Caucus, for endorsing new mass censorship by demanding that Mark Zuckerberg become our censor in chief. I blame that completely on the Progressive Caucus, on Adam Schiff, and on my good friend who I've known for years, Jan Schakowsky, for saying we have to start censoring the internet. No, we don't. The answer to a lie is the truth, not censorship. And what's happened is you could say, okay, well, they shouldn't have taken down your story, Greg Palast, but that's the problem. Robots are not very good censors. 2010, Deepwater Horizon blows up in the Gulf. Again, an accident. No, it wasn't. 17 months earlier, British Petroleum had an identical blowout in the Caspian Sea, and it was covered up by the US State Department, by Exxon, by British Petroleum, and by Chevron. I put that story on the front page of The Guardian. I put that story at the top of a program called Dispatches, the big primetime public affairs program in England. It never appeared in the US. Dan Rather is going to run it, but he got scared. Threats from British Petroleum. So they didn't run that story. That was vital. In 2004, Carrie Wan was a story I ran showing that in Ohio, the number of, and Nina Turner will be familiar with this, the number of ballots that were so-called spoiled and not counted, discounted, provisional ballots that were rejected were enough to have given John Kerry the Ohio and the win of the presidency in 2004. That was the front page of the Observer and Guardian in Britain. And yet the New York Times simply ran a response without mentioning the story, said, quote, "Internet rumors of Kerry victory easily debunked." So, that's that commonality of the groupthink. I did a story on financial vultures in Africa and these billionaires who are behind Trump and Bush and others, including a guy named Paul the Vulture Singer. He threatened BBC for running that story in The Guardian. One of his lawyers called up and said, "We have a file on Greg Palast." But at least BBC said, "But we have a file." He apparently has a file on Paul Singer. Nevertheless, it very much killed the story from running in the US. The same guy, the same billionaire that got the story spiked about his activities in Africa was able to spike the story, which was on the front page of The Nation in 2008, called Romney's Bailout Billionaires. Not many people know that Mitt Romney secretly made over $100 million on the auto bailout through a secret ownership of GM's auto parts operation, Delphi. And they moved all their plants, like including the one in Dayton, Ohio, to China. That was front page of The Nation. And the AP, by the way, no story gets into US papers unless it's endorsed by the AP News Service. The AP reporter told Bob King, head of the United Auto Workers, when King said, "How come you're not running Palast's story?" And the AP reporter for the auto industry said, "Bob, it's one of the most amazing stories I've seen about the auto industry in my career. It's also the first time in my 30-year career that I got a call from Washington, D.C. saying, do not run this story, do not touch this story, do not mention this story." It goes on. Dan Rather in 2004, he was fired for talking about, for breaking in the US, the story of how George Bush got out of Vietnam by his daddy fixing it for him to get into the Air Guard. He was fired. CBS 60 Minutes withdrew the story. Well, that story was the story actually I first ran with some others in The Guardian in Britain. And I offered the head of CBS at that time, Leslie Moonves, $100,000 if he could produce the information that he said he had that let Bush off the hook, that Bush did not use daddy to get into the Air Guard. I said, if you have that evidence, I'll give you $100,000 for it. But we at BBC and The Guardian are sticking with that story. That's just 10 stories. And I could do another 25 that have been spiked from the US media. Each one vitally important. Each one you didn't get to hear, except, some mentions on Between the Lines or snuck into Democracy Now! Or Flashpoint's, Dennis Bernstein's program out of KPFA. But when it gets to mainstream in the US, I'm mainstream in the rest of the world, but out of the stream in the US.
Thank you so much, Greg. Those are captivating yet very disturbing stories, and especially disturbing that they were not covered especially in mainstream American news media. And I definitely want to hear more about that momentarily. Right now, I'm going to go in the order of the panelists and asking each panelist a question or two. I want to start with Nina. Nina, I was really struck by what you were saying about this lack of class consciousness in American news media. I could not agree more with that analysis. And I'm just wondering if you could speak generally to your experience with mainstream media coverage, especially as you were running for public office as a progressive African-American woman.
Yeah, thank you for that, Victor. And it's certainly very hard when you are going against the grain, when you go against the status quo. And my very existence in politics is one that goes against the status quo for humanity. And because mainstream media, and I have been blessed to be a commentator from time to time on mainstream media as a progressive, but let me just move back from that a little bit. By and large, the formula that mainstream media uses does not lend itself to an invitation or a broad opening for progressive voices, because mainstream media, and I'm not talking about the individual commentators or reporters, certainly have the same donors, if you will, that many of the politicians that navigate the halls of Congress do. And so when we look at power, whether it's elected power or it's corporate power, that type of status quo power is in partnership. Another reason why we need independent media. So it's certainly important, when I put on my lens as a candidate, Victor, to answer your question, it's important that individuals running for office have the opportunity to lay out their agenda and their plan and for their voices to be heard. But if you have mainstream media outlets where they are predisposed for the most part to mainly lift those voices of people who navigate their lane, meaning keeping the status quo, that leaves out a lot of people like me. Putting a Black woman on it, on progressive, definitely brings the hellfire, because certain voices should be heard as long as they echo what those in power want to have echoed. When you step out of that, that is when the system itself comes barreling down on you. And, as a movement leader, I certainly understand that too. So there are multi dimensions to the role that I play, in both as a movement leader, somebody who has been elected to office, somebody who's run for office, somebody who has served with and for politicians, both running for office. It brings a very unique dynamic when you bring a freedom fighting voice, and that is not necessarily the voice that mainstream media wants to be heard most often. And then we've certainly seen, in these spaces and these places, a denial or rejection of those voices, because the powers that be do not want people, the American people or anybody for that matter, to have the opportunity to have robust ideas, to really think and to see something from another angle, another way. And independent media like Between the Lines and others certainly give us that opportunity to make sure that those voices are heard. It is important that all voices are heard. It is that the tension, that yin and the yang. What is the other side of that? My grandmother used to always say there are three sides to every story: your side, their side, and the right side. And if you have a media outlets that don't even want the voices of others to be heard because it does not go by the script that has already been pre-written, so to speak, by those in power, it causes the type of chaos and one-sidedness that we find ourselves facing in our country right now.
Thank you, Nina. I just want to follow up with one quick question. Of course,
Sure.
one of the themes of the panel is the importance of maintaining independent media. And I was just wondering, while you were involved in your various campaigns, were there independent media outlets that you could rely on, that you were able to use? And of course, Between the Lines is obviously one of them, but were there
Yes.
others?
Oh, definitely. I mean, TYT, of which, I commentate, I'm a commentator on TYT. David Sirota, the Daily Poster, and David and I worked on Senator Sanders' 2020 campaign together. Jacobin, Cal Kaminsky, David Doyle, The Nation, Ben Dixon, Tim Black, Brianna Joy Gray. And I'm sure I'm leaving so many out, but just to give you an example of how important it is to have independent media that is able to offset what may or may not be happening in mainstream media. Those outlets that I just named, those individuals that I just named, were such a blessing to me as a candidate, but also a blessing to the progressive movement itself. Let me say that as well. And again, those who I'm leaving out, but those outlets and those individuals definitely lifted my campaign and the voices of the movement. And Victor, just one other quick thing I want to say is that in my commentary, I do believe that mainstream media has a role. And to the extent that voices like mine and others, like this esteemed panelist, like if we're able to be there, and again, I have been blessed to be a commentator on mainstream media, doing my best to bring the progressive lens, the working class lens to the mainstream. So although we're talking about and we're lifting up independent media, which I want to see grow and become even more robust, we still must insist that different voices, progressive voices, are on mainstream media as well, because so many people still absorb. They still watch and participate with mainstream media. Our voices should be everywhere. Long way for me to say that independent voices should be everywhere, including mainstream media.
Thank you, Nina. That was perfect. Great list of outlets, and I couldn't agree more that we have to have at least a two-pronged approach where we are growing our own alternative independent media, but also not giving up on the fight with mainstream media and making sure that we get alternative, progressive voices in the mainstream media as well. Such
Absolutely.
a key point.
Yeah.
So thank you. So next, I'd like to turn to Adrian and ask a question or two based on some of your earlier comments. You were talking about, I think you already hinted at this a lot. You already gave us a sense of what's wrong with mainstream media, especially as they cover issues related to climate change. And I was especially struck by the problem with false equivalence, how, you can find one climate change denier that will somehow equate with, scientific consensus. But can you speak a little bit more to these problems? It's sort of twin problems of disinformation and censorship in mainstream media coverage that we face today, and especially regarding issues related to climate change.
Yes, of course. I believe that climate change misinformation is definitely increasing substantially online. And just to put that in context, less than 10% of misleading posts on Facebook describing climate change as a hoax or something along those lines, less than 10% of those posts get marked as misinformation. And also in 2021, in a study that was calculated across 60 days, there were already 25 million views of misinformation related to climate science and renewable energy. So this has huge implications. And the way that Facebook manages disinformation is very questionable. So a look into that process is that with climate change specifically, there's a small number of sources that spread most of the disinformation on Facebook that were flagged in 2020, but Facebook has still declined to remove those pages and resisted calls to remove disinformation the way that it does for COVID-19 or election misinformation. And instead, they focus on trying to promote correct information with providing a short pop-up right under that misinformation that gives a little shortcut to the Facebook Climate Science Center page. And of course, that gets less views than the posts themselves. Another way that they
So you want more censorship? You want more censorship of the net?
Hold on, Greg. We're gonna. I already sense this tension rising between your two positions, so we'll get into that momentarily.
Well, I want to know the answer.
Well, just to finish this little paragraph, and they also rely on third-party fact checkers to label their false claims, which can be confusing if viewers are seeing one thing and then a fact label check that's saying another thing. This can leave people confused and believing neither. And yeah, also another thing to consider beyond Facebook is that YouTube is also, they have said that they would stop monetizing content related to climate change myths and misinformation. But those videos have been left up and are still receiving millions of views, and more than $200 million in ads have been spent on sites filled with climate change myths. And yeah, just in general, global warming misinformation is primarily published on web pages, blogs, television shows, other forms of mass media, which are generally more accessible to the public than scientific journals. And so the real science is typically not accessible to the general public. And so the result is that misinformation is reaching more people than the science. And in terms of censorship, I definitely feel that this has hugely impacted the state of how the general public views climate change today. For decades, scientists have been silenced and not given a platform, while corporations, politicians, and think tanks have dominated and sold the public the idea that climate change did not yet receive a scientific consensus, when all along this was a cover-up for fossil fuel industries to continue to pollute. And so I believe that the conversations around climate change would be so much more on track today, and we would be working towards progressive action had it not been for the censorship and misinformation across these years. And a part of censorship that has impacted me directly as a community organizer has been the way that, for example, Meta, who runs Facebook, deems environmental ads as political ads. And so it bars pages from promoting the ad unless you go through a lengthy authorization process to verify your identity. So my organization, the New Haven Climate Movement, we've been unable to promote our posts for the last couple of years in our sort of shadow band, you could say. So there's a silencing of organizers and grassroots political efforts who are just trying to get the word out on social media.
Thank you, Adrian. Deeply disturbing. And it also speaks to these inherently thorny issues, because we want to make sure that misinformation and disinformation doesn't get amplified, especially through social media, but also through mainstream media, which is often where they're originating. Do you have any, and I wrestle with this all the time, so I don't have any easy answers, but how do we to get to Greg's question, how do we pressure Facebook or even mandate that Facebook does a better job of not amplifying mis and disinformation, but also not end up performing some kind of censorship that Greg's very worried about? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely a tough issue. And I feel like the methods that Meta is taking right now are, they make sense, but they're overall like, they're still allowing disinformation to get out there. For example, like I was mentioning with providing their own climate science info center, even though that gets less views typically than the post itself that is spreading misinformation. So overall, I feel like there should be some type of balance that we reach, because it is important that we have free press and that people and organizations are allowed to express themselves, but also it's really harmful for climate change and other progressive topics like this to actually get their truth out there. And so that's just another reason to highlight the importance of independent media channels. But with social media, it's definitely a tricky topic, but I guess I sort of do lean more towards, let's just try to take down the threat of misinformation overall. But overall, I feel like Facebook is probably going to stick with their status quo because they are getting more money from these ads. And so they're not trying to let all that go by banning misinformation overall. So it's definitely a really tricky situation. But I do think at this point in time, it's getting to be an even bigger issue for climate change. And I always keep the deadline sort of 2030 in my mind. And, we're already at 2022 in terms of 2030 being when the UN says, we need to chop global emissions by at least 50% globally to, try to put in place a healthy future. And so this deadline is looming so near that I don't think we can really take any more misinformation on this issue.
Thank you, Adrian. I couldn't agree more that the stakes couldn't be higher. So I'm with you on this. And of course, I think in the ideal world, we would have a non-commercial public alternative to Facebook, but we have to deal with Facebook at the moment, which serves as a kind of gatekeeper for all of our information, or at least increasingly so as we get our information through Facebook. But I think Greg feels differently on this issue, and I think we'll switch the cue here. Since Greg, you were speaking to this issue, or if you'd like to speak on something else, on some of the other stories that spiked.
I do. I'm happy to go on the other stories that are spiked. Well, let me give you one, and maybe we'll have time to show the 2-minute report I did from Georgia, a couple of them. I did a story for Democracy Now! In which, and originally, by the way, it was supposed to be for the Washington Post, but they got nervous and went to other outlets. But a repeat of a story done in 2018, mentioned by Stacey Abrams. One, the Secretary of State of Georgia, who's considered by many heroic, removed 198,000 voters from the voter rolls of Georgia before this last election. 198,000 voters on the grounds that they no longer lived in Georgia or their home county. 198,000 of those people did not move. They're at the registration address they were, or in their county where they can still vote. Literally removing hundreds of thousands of voters of color and young people, literally. Now, went to federal court with that. I did a report for that for the ACLU before I did the Democracy Now! Piece, and I went to court as a witness for Black Voters Matter to try to reverse this mass racial purge, blackout of the voter rolls of Georgia. So I did get that story up on Democracy Now!, but it was taken down by YouTube, as Adrian would like, this removal of, this policing and censorship system. Why was it taken down by YouTube? I don't know. It's hard to speak to the robot. Consortium News, which ran an hour-long interview with me on it, asked them, why exactly would we be taken down? And we got a robot answer. We have reviewed, this is a 45-minute piece, and we got back an answer in about 12 minutes that we have re-reviewed the piece, and it doesn't meet our community standards. And this is what I'm concerned about. There's three words that are a real danger to journalism, and which we heard today. I believe in free press, but are the three most dangerous words that we have. Free press means free press. I would rather respond to lies with the truth. The problem of demanding that Mark Zuckerberg or and YouTube and Bill Gates become our international censors in chief is just what happened to Adrian's group, which is that she can't get on, so that the liars talking about, oh, climate science is bullshit, that's on. I can tell you from Prager, so-called Prager University, complete FACO site, that's on, because you know how to game that system. But your group is off because you can't get that authorization, which is expensive and difficult. How about we end censorship? How about we say, we don't tell the phone company, oh, wait a minute, you had someone talking on the phone that Trump really won the election. That call should have been cut off. We don't ask the phone company to cut off your calls. We don't ask newspapers we don't say we can't have that newspaper on the street because it denies climate science. What we have to do is say freedom of the press, freedom of speech means freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and there's no but in the Constitution. That's in Orwell's 1984 that you have the but with the freedom of speech. But I hope that we are not in the progressive movement now saying, I want Mark Zuckerberg to take down all the people I don't like because he's going to do because what happens is that I get pulled down and you, Adrian, get pulled down and Nina Turner will get pulled down and Bill Fletcher will get turned down because we cannot, if our solution to the corporate lies out there, and I say corporate because people make money off those lies. They're a profit center lying. Quashing the news is a profit center. And if we start saying we want censorship, but we want our censorship, we want to control the censorship. No, I don't think so. Sorry, count me out. I'm for freedom of the press, and freedom of the press means just that. I've been a victim of the not freedom of the press, and I've been around this world and just in Kazakhstan. Is anyone really reporting what's happening in Kazakhstan? I was there. They're the dictator. There was one journalist who reported things that the dictator didn't like, and he committed suicide, supposedly. He shot himself in the head twice. I'm not for censorship by bullets, by Mark Zuckerberg's committees, or any type of censorship, because I have seen what's happened in the US with censorship, and our fight should be against censorship of all types, especially the censorship of money being stuffed in the mouths of our main news spokespeople.
Thank you, Greg. It's definitely a discussion we'll continue to pick up on. Many of our viewers, for example, were asking questions about how do we deal with the big lie in mainstream media. And I think there are various ways that we should try to weed out dangerous mis and disinformation. But I also agree that there are always concerns about different forms of censorship. There's also market censorship, commercial censorship. There's so many layers of censorship that we could talk about. But so let's get back to this momentarily. But first, I want to go to Bill Fletcher and hear from him especially about labor issues, Bill. And you were talking in your earlier comments about this kind of ideological policing that occurs in a lot of our mainstream news media. And yet in the last few years, there's been such tremendously exciting labor activism on so many fronts. I'm just wondering, I'd like to hear from you. How do you think these issues are getting covered in the mainstream news media?
Well, actually, I want to jump into this discussion between Adrian and
okay,
Greg.
Please do. Whatever you want.
Let me just say something about that, then I'll get to your question. See, I think the problem I feel, Greg, is that there's no distinction between opinion and fact. And so when I'm looking at people talking about various solutions to COVID that are not solutions and that can kill you, and to the extent that that's presented as fact as opposed to opinion, to me, it's the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. And that's what I don't hear you addressing.
So you're saying that you have there's good censorship and bad censorship. And I'm sorry, the way that you answer a lie is with the truth. And yeah, you better shout fire in a theater that's on fire. It will save a lot of lives.
No,
let me tell you the number one story.
Let's stop playing that game.
Well, go ahead.
I'm talking about, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I'm saying shouting fire in a crowded theater. I'm not talking about when there's a fire. I'm talking about when someone decides.
Do you want Mark Zuckerberg to censor Adrian or you or me? Do you want him to have that power or required by the state?
I want? I want opinions labeled opinions.
Okay.
Right? I don't want, in part because of the low literacy, actual in practical terms, in the United States, I don't want things that are presented, whether it's about the environment or about COVID or whatever, presented as fact when it's opinion. Because see, it's also dovetails with this phenomena that's increasing, whereby people think that an opinion is as legitimate as the facts, that you cannot question my opinion because it's my opinion. Well, I don't care whether it's your opinion. Is it a fact? Right? So that's my concern. Now, who does that?
So let me ask you. Okay, so for 22 years, I spent about 80% of my time talking about one of the most censored subjects in America, including this week, which is the suppression of the black vote. Suppression is a really nice term, polite term. Right. No one ever says when your car is suppressed. When your car is stolen, you don't say my car is suppressed. In fact, the fact that I say that votes are stolen from black people has prevented me from going on the air in almost every mainstream outlet now. You have to say suppression. Now, here's the thing. Okay, so here's the stories that have been killed. I just mentioned those stories. About 80% of the stories that have been spiked are stories that I've run about screwing black people out of their votes.
Right.
And when, for example, I just did a news story. There's new voter vigilantes in Georgia. There's a new law which comes back from 1946 from Jim Crow. The new law, SB 202, allows anyone to challenge the vote of any other voter. One GOP operative has personally challenged 32,000 voters, almost all of them black people. I showed her photos of the people who she challenged, black people and young people. She never met them. She doesn't know them. That's an important story, that she challenged 30,000 people, and there are 360,000 people altogether whose vote has been challenged.
Right.
You know why I can't get that on the air? And you know where that story was spiked? I was doing it for MSNBC. Now you're saying, why is that? That's because the position of Adam Schiff and others, especially Democrats, is that America has perfect elections, that no election in America has ever been stolen. And when you talk about stolen votes, Adam Schiff has said, anyone who says elections in America are not fair, are wrong, and the votes aren't counted is undermining democracy. Now that's Adam Schiff, and that because of that attitude, you can only talk about suppression of the black voters, screwing black people out of their votes in the most oblique manner. Because if you say an election was stolen, then you're undermine democracy. In 2018, I did a report for Salon in which I discovered 300,000 people wrongly removed from the voter rolls, including Martin Luther King's 92-year-old cousin. I was there at the polling station when she was thrown out. They said she didn't live in Georgia. Then I went down to the street to her house, obviously in Georgia, where she used to have King over for dinner on Sunday afternoons. And that story, was completely buried, except on things like Trevor Noah and the Daily Show picked it up. But I couldn't get down on the news for anything because Stacey Abrams said the election was stolen from me. And now Stacey Abrams is being roundly attacked for saying elections get stolen in America, that it's un-American to say so. And that's what they are censoring. That's what they're censoring.
Greg, your argument is a non sequitur. It had nothing to do with the argument that I raised. Nothing. I mean,
what you're saying is you
have written good, well-documented articles that for political purposes have been censored. That's right. Not what I'm talking about. I don't think that's what Adrian's talking about.
But that's the result of closing off, of saying that there's certain subjects that are taboo. When I say election's been stolen, and it
No, I
was
don't think
stolen in
that's-
2000, it was stolen in 2004. Stacey Abrams had her election stolen from her. These are stolen elections.
I don't think that it follows. I think that there's a reason that these
because as soon
stories
as
are being
I
suppressed.
okay.
There's nothing to do with censorship in some sort of abstract sense. You're running a political line that these folks don't want, right? So
Absolutely.
let's just be clear. That has nothing to do with posting something about if I drink Ajax, that I will somehow be cured of COVID, right?
Well, I
That's
just
what I'm
told
talking about.
Yeah, but I told you YouTube, under these new rules forced on them by the Progressive Caucus, took down my my story that was on Democracy
So it was
Now!
obviously a mistake.
Well, exactly. But that's the problem. Do you think that Mark Zuckerberg reads 200 million posts a day and says, oh, that's the wrong one? That's just opinion. No. It's a robot or some guy in China. And that's how the censorship is going to run. We should not. The problem is that when we stand up for censorship, we are allowing ourselves to be censored. You know, it's like, oh, well, censor him, but don't censor me. Let Greg Palast YouTube go on. Let Adrian's group go on, but take down these others. I don't think we can do that with freedom of speech. I think that the way to answer a lie or the way to answer bullshit opinion is to call it out and call out bullshit, call out the lie. I think that's the way to do it. Now, we have many, many other problems with the mainstream media, especially in the US. I just said, I just gave you a list of 10 stories that the mainstream media had spiked. But I'm telling you, we are accelerating the spiking. We're accelerating the problem by saying we're for censorship. You're not going to stop Prager University. I know Alex Jones well. You're not going to stop Alex Jones or Prager University, this fake right-wing university on the air, et cetera. You're not going to stop these guys from getting out there. Nonsense, filth, misdirection, lies, BS, and dog whistle racism.
I hear you,
Greg.
we don't agree. I hear you.
Yeah, I probably side with Bill and Adrian on this debate as well, but it's an important debate, and we don't unfortunately have enough time to keep hashing out. I don't want to be a censor here and shut anyone down, but we do have to keep in mind that Nina will have to unfortunately leave us in a few minutes. And I did very quickly, Bill, before we go to closing statements here, can you just speak a little bit to the labor activism and how it gets covered in mainstream media?
Well, labor activism only irregularly gets covered. You have, when there is a strike, when there is a labor defeat, there's coverage. Every so often, in part, if a union has a well-organized communications program and some level of base, it's able to break through. The Chicago Teachers Union is an example of that. It's very hard, in part because it goes back to this country is one that is very hostile to the working class in general, very hostile to labor organization. It has the record of being having the most violent history of worker capitalist relations of any of the advanced capitalist countries. And it's not just the violence of shooting people, it's also the violence of suppressing the voice of the worker. And so it's very, very difficult to break in, which is another very strong argument for independent journalism. But to build on what Nina was saying, the independent journalism itself has to be class conscious, because you also have within independent journalism those that tend to downplay class, if not ignore it entirely. They might talk about race, they may talk about gender, they may talk about some other things, but they're very uneasy about talking about issues of class. And so I think that there's a battle in the mainstream as well as independent media around class, around unions, around labor as a whole.
Thank you, Bill. This is also a very important discussion that I wish we could spend a whole hour just talking about class and media and how they cover labor issues. And perhaps we'll get back to it in the final half hour. But right now, if each panelist will give us a closing statement, maybe talk about something that we can leave the audience with in terms of a call to action or a provocative idea. And Nina, I'd like to start with you since I know you're going to have to jump in a few minutes.
Thanks so much. And again, thanks Between the Lines. It was such a pleasure, Scott, you and your team, and the panelists that I am privileged to be with, even virtually. I'm really honored to be with you all. I want to say I definitely agree with the point that Bill was making about how things are labeled within media right now. We have much more commentary going on these days than what we did when I was growing up. At least I don't recall a whole lot of commentary on news shows when I was forced to watch the news. And having that clear delineation may help. It won't solve the entire problem, but I think Bill is hitting the nail on the head. People need to know, even these people with followings and fancy titles, and they have all their own shows. Are they facts or are they giving commentary? There's a difference. Am I laying out the facts or am I giving my opinion? And far too many, whether it's Fox News, all the news channels do it, but just in particular, making sure that viewers know that this person is spouting their opinion, their ideology, and not necessarily throwing down the facts certainly would be a start. I would say for our viewers, for people who tune in to listen to us and the robust debates that have waged since we've been together, that we must continue to support independent media. A lot of times independent media hosts and shows have subscriptions. If all of us would subscribe to independent media so that we can help independent media grow, that would be extraordinarily helpful. And then I hope someday, soon, that independent media in ways would unite so that we can be a real force to bump up against the mainstream media narrative. I think TYT comes the closest. It is the largest, right now. And I want to see more independent media do the same thing so that we can compete head to head with mainstream media. But the power is certainly in the hands of the people to subscribe to and also donate to independent media outlets, because these outlets do not have corporate sponsors. You're not going to see the corporate commercials play for them. We are their life's blood. And so we got to make that investment just a little bit. Time, talent, or treasure. We all can give something to help these media outlets continue to grow and to become stronger.
Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you for joining us. This has been a real,
My pleasure.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, next, Adrian, can we hear a closing statement from you, please?
Yeah, definitely echoing Nina. Subscribe and support to your favorite independent journalism outlet. And overall, just to summarize some key takeaways, I feel like with climate change, media itself isn't going to solve the crisis, but it is a huge part of the work. The work is going to come from grassroots organizers and from huge investments and policy decisions, but media can get us a lot of the way there. And overall, I feel like it is more important than ever to support independent journalism with, like I had mentioned before, the really steep decrease in climate-related journalism on the corporate scale. And overall, we can't just be hearing about climate change when there is an extreme weather event or a humanitarian crisis. There's always news to cover related to climate change. And the more that folks hear about it, and also the more they hear about solutions, I feel like that is a really important piece in how we can get people to listen and potentially to get involved or contribute to the cause. And overall, just in terms of tying it all together, like climate change needs to be framed as a part of all the different crises that are happening in terms of the environment. We really need to put this all together and amplify the voices of frontline communities and marginalized voices. And we need to be talking about climate change throughout the year. And I think that media outlets, whether it is on the radio or in print or on the television, can all do their part in amplifying climate change and talking about this issue, because I feel like we have just had way too many decades of misinformation and disinformation that have really convinced the public that there is still not a scientific consensus on this, or that there's just a debate on climate change in general. And at this point, there should not be a debate on whether it's happening, because it's happening, and it's happening rapidly here and across the world. So I believe that media has the chance to really convey that message to their audiences, and we really need to make use of these outlets, because we are truly running out of time, and we owe it to ourselves, the youth, marginalized communities, the whole world, to get the truth out and to make sure that we can take the steps towards trying to ensure a healthy climate, because time is running out.
Thank you, Adrian. Bill, can you give us a closing idea or call to action?
Yeah, thank you, Victor. See, I think we're dealing with an organizing challenge. That obviously there's the issues of democratic involvement, and democratic with a small d, involvement in the media. Fundamentally, it's an organizing challenge. The oppressed never in history have had more resources than the oppressor. They've never had greater access to the media than the oppressor. So one of the things we have to start with is that sober realization, because we're not going to be able to compete with Fox News. Progressives are not going to have the resources of Fox News. Now, having said that, we have to think of this as an asynchronous fight. So it's the fight of the small against the large, and that means that we have to do both intense fact-finding and documentation that Greg and others have done, but we also have to be organizing around these stories, and we have to be creating enough trouble, to be blunt, that various media outlets feel compelled to address them. Because the problem is, and despite my disagreement with you, Greg, I have an immense amount of respect for you and your work. Regardless of how good your work is, and he knows this, by himself, he can just be brushed aside. But when the story catches on, think about Occupy. When Occupy first started on Wall Street, there was an attempt by the mainstream media to ignore it entirely, to dismiss it as irrelevant, if not silly. But it took on a life of its own, and it forced itself into media. And I think that's the way we've got to think about this. This is an organizing challenge.
Thank you, Bill. Greg?
Wow. Okay, Bill, I'm going to print out your remarks and pass them around, because that's exactly what it is. We say it's an organizing challenge because underneath that, what you're saying is something I've believed a long time. Journalism is class war by other means.
That's right.
And they want to make sure that there's stories you don't get. And if I get nervous about censorship, because I always feel that the powers that be end up using it against us. I want to make the case for investigative journalism. But picking up on what Bill and Adrian and also Nina said, investigative journalism isn't cheap. It's very difficult. And then you've got lawsuits to defend, and it could take months. And for 20 years, one of the reasons I went into journalism was for 20 years, I was the labor union advisor. And Bill, as you well know, we couldn't get our stories out. And when I did that front page story for The Nation on how these financial vultures, including one Mitt Romney, closed down 35 auto parts plants in America and moved them to China, using $8 billion in subsidies from the auto bailout that Obama gave them. That story was about working people in America. And you couldn't get that story out against the headwinds. Again, I told you the AP reporter says the first time in 30 years he got called from Washington, don't touch the story. Because it's not the story they want to hear. You turn on National Petroleum Radio and you get Marketplace, and they'll tell you what the market did today, and this new corporation, and this latest IPO where some 12-year-old made $2 billion. But you don't hear about, how about instead of the market report today, we get the wage report today. Who got what? how much are wages going down because of inflation. Now, that's the real story. We're not getting the labor story. And like you say, the only thing we get covered for labor is strikes. Like we're holding up the public, we're harming the public. But the grievance ain't there. So that's one of the things that drove me to journalism, because I couldn't get the labor stories in those papers. And when I try to do it again with like the Delphi story, it does get spiked, but it is a fight. And I have to say that the United Auto Workers took my story, reprinted hundreds of thousands of copies, and handed it out to every auto worker in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan. And that was vital in that campaign to get the truth out. So it is about facts. Opinions are cheap. You turn on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whatever. It's all blah, 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 blah. The day's news, blah, 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 blah. And the news that you get into your papers are all from the newswire services, which is all prefabricated, pre-chewed crap. And they don't want to spend the money, take the chance, take the risk, and also go off from whatever the chit chat is for the day. One of the reasons, I couldn't get in the story about the latest in vote suppression in Georgia is partly because, well, it wasn't in the news cycle for that day. And Rachel Maddow has to talk about whatever the president said or whatever was the top story in the New York Times, which is all from press conferences and press releases. It's too expensive to do real, original investigative reporting. When you talk about climate change, I was up in the Arctic. I was in the Amazon, where in Ecuador, where Chevron crapped all over the Amazon and poisoned people, including the chief of the Kofan Indians in Ecuador. His son went swimming in a 3-year-old son went swimming in a pool, a lagoon in the jungle, and came up spitting up oil residue and blood and died in his arms. He sued Chevron. His lawyer, Stephen Donziger, he got an American lawyer to help him. They won a $9 billion judgment. They never got the money, but as we speak, Stephen Donziger has been charged with federal crimes and is serving a sentence for supposed contempt of court. That story is virtually nowhere. The only story that's there is that the criminal Stephen Donziger and the cheating, lying natives, that was in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. But I couldn't, on BBC television and The Guardian on the front page, I talked about what the oil companies did in Ecuador, but you couldn't get that on the petroleum broadcast system to save your life. This is a problem. So like you say, it's an organizing question, because in a class war, the opposing generals aren't going to hand you their weapons, which is the media. So I agree. In supporting independent media more than anything is the real key. And by the way, you can always donate to the Palast Investigative Fund at CraigPalast.com. But hey, at this moment, in fact, if you got a few shekels between the lines, they give me a platform for these important investigative stories. I really mean it. Please support Between the Lines. It's a lifeline for hard facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That's an excellent note. We do have a little bit of time here to carry on the conversation and address some of the questions from the listeners, but I really want to pick up on this theme. By the way, I love the line, "Journalism is class war by another means." I feel like that needs to be our bumper stickers. But
Bill.
Picking up on
Thank
that
Bill
idea that Bill is talking about, it's an organizing problem. We're hearing this recurring theme of how it really is this is class politics. And Nina was talking earlier about how we need to pool our resources together. And you, Greg, were talking about how expensive it is to do actual journalism. Many of our listeners were asking questions about how do those of us who are engaged in progressive politics and care about progressive issues and indeed care about the future of the planet, how do we contest the power of right-wing media? And so I'm just thinking in terms of short-term strategy, which I think we already have some ideas on the table here, but also in terms of a long-term strategy where we know that as long as we are constrained to commercial media, our issues are always going to be given short shrift, where they increasingly aren't even doing journalism anymore. So what do we do? What's to be done both in the short term and the long term? And this is an open question to any of you. Please feel free to jump in.
If no one else, I'll speak. Number one, Nina Turner gave you a damn good idea. First, go to outlets which actually have the real information. I mean, obviously, go to gregpalast.com, sign up. It's a free subscription and get my reports, whether if they don't put them on the air, or you'll see my reports for Rolling Stone or Democracy Now! Or these other outlets or BBC. You can get them and pass them around. Let's make our own media. The great value of the internet is that we can pass around our own stories. The only reason my story about how Bush stole the election in 2000 by removing black people from the voter rolls, it only got out because of the internet. Like I say, it wasn't covered by the New York Times, except in Bob Herbert's column, for 4 years. So we can get these, so get the good stuff and send it out to your list, send it out to your people, encourage people. We need our own drum. We need our own media. And that means also getting around, not just tuning into the shows passively, but saying, I heard something fantastic on Young Turks today. I heard something on Between the Lines that everyone else should get, and push people to get that info. And, obviously get my info out if no one else can. That's number one. Number two, obviously put a few shekels in. The Koch brothers now own the petroleum broadcast system. When you talk about corporate media, don't forget PBS and NPR. BBC, which I work with, we can't take any corporate money. We don't have any programs sponsored by Archer Daniels Monopoly. British Petroleum buys a big chunks of PBS. That's why you didn't get the Ecuador story. And Chevron is the number, that most people don't know that Chevron is the number one corporate sponsor of the PBS News Hour. And so, this is the problem that we're getting. So we have to definitely use our own media, get the word out, get the word around, and whatever it takes, whether it's the unions handing out leaflets with the stories or telling people to tune in. We have some really brilliant programs and we have some really brilliant outlets. Let's get that stuff out, because if we have to rely on the corporate media or try to push them, the only way you can push them, by the way, is by making a kind of legal issue or public in the streets issue, as we saw with Occupy. So, for example, I was able to get my story about the purge of voters in Georgia into the Washington Post and New York Times because Black Voters Matter took my material and filed a federal lawsuit. So they'll cover that. Black Voters Matter sues Georgia over vote suppression. Georgia officials say that's bullshit. So, it's one side this and one side that, but at least it's a way, by creating actions based on the information, it's one way to kind of get the dinosaur of mainstream media to pay attention.
Thanks, Greg. Bill, were you going to jump in on this question?
Yeah, thanks. Three things. One is, I think we need to have a political struggle around public radio and public television. And really a programmatic demand that goes to exactly what you're raising, Greg, about funding. Who funds these things? Because the implications are very, very clear when you have to rely on these corporations. And see, the thing is, I don't fault PBS or NPR for taking the money, because they have been strangled by politicians who have reduced the budgets. And if they're going to survive, they're going to have to do this. So that's one thing, political struggles around that. The second thing is that we need to be organizing, but not just around media issues. In other words, progressives need to be present, not just on the East Coast and the West Coast, but in Republican-dominated states. We need to be doing union organizing, farm organizing, et cetera, environmental organizing. And part of our objective must be to create doubt. That is, to create doubt about the dominant narrative. And so it's not just about organizing for jobs or for better income or to save the environment, but to raise doubt about the dominant narrative about everything from in these Republican-dominated places, what happened in the 2020 elections or the issue of climate change or whatever. So there's an ideological fight that needs to take place at a level that's not just at the level of Greg, not just at the level of Democracy Now! Or anyone else, but is at a level of the mass organizer. And I think that becomes incredibly important in making this move, because it's not, and this is not to speak against what you were raising, Greg. All of those things I agree with and that have to be done. I'm just adding to that because we have to, there's this exercise that's wonderful to use when you're starting a training. It's called a 9-dot exercise. And it's where you have 9 dots that look like they're in a box, 3, 3, 3, separated by about 1 inch or so. And you have to connect all of the dots with one line without going over the same line twice and without taking your pen off the paper. Everybody fails this the first time. In Star Trek parlance, it's the Kobayashi-Maru scenario. Everybody fails it. And the reason is because everybody makes the assumption that you have to do this in a box. The only way you can do it is by literally going outside of the box. And that's what we have to be doing when we're taking on the fight around the media. Going outside of the parameters that we're told we're not supposed to exit.
Thank you, Bill. That's brilliant. I've never heard about the box in that context. Mm-hmm. If I could abuse my role as moderator for just a second and pick up on a theme that you mentioned, Bill, about reforming our public media system, mm-hmm. And really trying to organize a political battle around that. I would also agree that there needs to be long-term structural media reform for any sort of long-term political agenda that we have on the left side of things. And of course, groups like Free Press have been organizing around these issues. I've been involved with that organization for many years. But I also want to throw out one factoid, which is at the federal level, Americans spend about $1.40 of federal funding per person per year. That's compared to British citizens that spend about $100 per person per year for the BBC. So if we start thinking in terms of how we could be funding our mm-hmm. public media and also transforming it and making sure that it's democratized, I think that might give us some long-term hope. But that's one of my pet projects. I want to go to Adrian and ask you, Adrian, if you'd like to weigh in on any of these things we were just talking about or something entirely different.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of Greg's ideas. I definitely agree. And I think that growing up in Generation Z, it's a very unique time in terms of, technology and social media. And I think it is a wonderful opportunity that everyone truly, has a platform these days, whether it's, you could consider your email contact list your platform, or whether you use social media or LinkedIn, whatever it is, everyone truly does have a platform. And I feel like there are so many ways nowadays that people can share their opinion or get the truth out. You can make a blog, you can actually, make a zine by hand, you can post on Facebook. There's really so many things the average person can do as long as they have access to the internet. And there's so many creative and inventive ways that people have been utilizing all these different options that we have today. One that actually was quite fascinating to me, actually, back in a couple years ago. So far, I've only found 3 of them, but in little baggies that I found in my hometown were these little folded up, independently published little newspapers called Messengers of Mystic that reported on various articles, some probably investigative journalism pieces, trying to get the truth out, things basically that denied mainstream sort of opinions. And I thought that was a really inventive and fascinating way to do things. So 2 of them I found in my hometown. One of them was passed to me at a climate rally. And I just thought that was very inventive. And we really need to see more of these things. It doesn't have to be physical. Of course, there's so many different blogs and outlets that are publishing online or multiple ways. But I just feel like in this generation, there's so many things that we can do, and we should all be using our platforms, whether it's sharing an independent journalism article with your friends or making your own zine. There's so many things that we could do.
Thank you, Adrian. That's such a great uplifting note to end our discussion for now. Of course, the discussion will continue in many different formats, but I just want to, before I hand it over to Scott, I just want to thank you all for this very lively conversation, an important conversation. We only scratched the surface on many of these issues, so let's continue it however we can. It's been my pleasure to moderate the panel, and now I'll hand it off to Scott to close us out. Thank you, Scott. It's all yours.
Thanks so much to our panelists Nina Turner, Greg Palast, Bill Fletcher Jr., Adrian Huq, and our moderator, Victor Picard, for participating in this important conversation about the crisis in U.S. journalism and the future of independent media and democracy. It was a real honor to have you all here to share your views on these critical issues we collectively face as progressive activists and media producers. I also want to give a special thanks to our board member, tech wizard and friend, Marco Roldan, who offered his time, many talents, skills, and patience that made this 30th anniversary virtual event possible. Thank you, Marco. Also, special thanks go out to Anna Manzo, my wife and partner in producing Between the Lines each week. Anna's hard work and support were critical in putting together tonight's celebration. Before we conclude, I want to also thank you, our audience, for spending time with us on our 30th anniversary celebration. Our program could not have been broadcast on dozens of radio stations and many other platforms all these years without listener support. If you're either a longtime listener or new to Between the Lines, please consider signing up for our free weekly podcasts, interview transcripts, and program summaries on our website at btlonline.org. We'll then be able to send you information on the topics and guests we present and special future events such as tonight's program.
Before we say goodnight, I'd like to ask you to make a contribution to Between the Lines in honor of the program's 30 years on the air, and to support our show's ongoing mission of presenting timely, in-depth, progressive analysis each week. Your one-time or monthly investment will help sustain Between the Lines' efforts to keep the voices of progressive activists, journalists, and academics alive in today's media landscape obsessed with sensationalism and celebrity infotainment. Visit our Between the Lines website at btlonline.org or text GIVE to BTL to 44321. Choose the donation amount that's right for you, and remember to subscribe to our free weekly podcasts, program summaries, and interview transcripts. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our anniversary celebration.